These are the notes for 6.0 Lesson 1, Day 1. So I just want to remind you all, for this entire unit, we cannot use any calculator. So make sure as you go through these problems, you're showing all the work and you're not cheating yourself, so we can still do well in our assessment later on. So the first thing we need to look at is place value. And we need to name these place values. So we see we have a decimal place here. Directly in front of our decimal place, we have our ones place. So I'm going to turn this just for a second. We have our ones place, our tens place, and our hundreds place. But what we really need to look at is the places after the decimal, because these are going to come in handy for whenever we are working with fractions later on. So directly after the decimal place, we have our tenths place, then our hundreds place, then the thousands place, and then the 10,000s place. And at any point in this video, if you decide that you need to pause it to write something down, you're more than welcome to do so. You don't have to keep it continually running the whole time. Okay, so now let's jump down here to comparing decimals. So it says to compare decimals, do not count digits. Just because a decimal has more numbers behind the decimal place does not make it bigger. We want to start with the largest place value and compare place by place until we figure out which is larger. And then as a reminder, this sign right here means less than, and this one right here means greater than. And so sometimes you can think of the sign as it's eating it, so it's going to eat the bigger number. So let's compare these two numbers right here. We have 4.29 and 4.5. So we would actually compare the 4's first, and we go, well, they're the same. And so then we go to our next number, which is the 2 and the 5, and they're in the same place. Well, we know that the 5 is larger than the 2, so we can go ahead and say 4.5 is larger than 4.29. Okay, so it says because the ones place is equal, so we said the 4's were equal, but the 5 is larger than the 2. Now the biggest catch here is that we cannot forget that negatives are opposite. So if I had to compare negative 0.429 and negative 4.5, it's the opposite. So whenever we deal with negatives, I tend to have you guys compare them first as if they're positives, and then just flip your sign. So let's look at our first examples here, if you guys want to write those down. Our first one is 0.75 times compared to 0.8. And so we notice here that our ones places are the same. They're both zeros. So then we move on to our tenths place. So we look at our 7 and our 8. Well, we know that 7 is smaller than 8, or 8 is larger than 7, which means that 0.75 is going to be less than 0.8. Even though 0.75 has two numbers there, it is still smaller than 0.8. So then we go to 6.375 compared to 6.2. So again, we start in our ones place, and we notice they both have 6's, which are the same, so we need to move on to our next place value. So look at our tenths place, so we're comparing our 3 and our 2. Well, we know 3 is larger than 2, so our first number, 6.375, is going to be larger than 6.2. Part C, we have 0.08 compared to 0.12. So again, we start with our ones place, and we notice they both have zeros. So we don't need to compare there. We can move on to our next place, which is our tenths. So we notice our first one has a 0 and our second one has a 1. Well, we know that 1 is going to be bigger than 0. So that's going to make 0.12 the bigger number than 0.08. So let's go down here to the second row. We have 2.1 and we compare it to 2.07. So we start with our ones place. We notice they're the same. So we go to our tenths place. Our first number has a 1, our second number has a 0. So it's automatically going to make my first number the larger number. So now let's start looking at our negatives, and we have to remember, don't forget negatives are opposite. So we start with our ones place again, and they both have 2s, so that's the same. Then we go to our tens place, and our first one has a 6 and our second one has a 5. Well, normally we would say 2.6 is bigger than 2.5, but we're dealing with negatives, so it's the opposite. Negative 2.6 is going to be less than negative 2.5. So let's try another one of these negatives. We start with our ones place, and we notice they're both zeros. So then we need to move on to our tens place. My first one is a 0 and my second one is a 5. Well, normally I would say my 0 is less than my 5 and I'd put a less than sign. But again, we're dealing with negatives and they're opposite. So negative 0.09 is actually greater than negative 0.5. So I want you all to try the next two on your own for me. If you want to pause the video real quick, you can. When we compare, we get this for our first one. For letter G, we get a greater than sign. For letter H, we get a greater than sign as well, because we're going back to our positive numbers, so it's our normal thinking. But now let's look at I. I is a little different because we have this 4.3 repeating. But when we have something repeating, we have to remember that that 3 is repeating. It's going on for forever. So typically we start with the ones, and we go, oh, those are the same. Then we go to our tens place, we go, well, those are the same too, so we need to go to our hundreds place. Well, the number that's in the hundreds place for this one, since our 3 is repeating, is actually another 3. So in this case, we're comparing a 3 to a 1. Well, we know 3 is bigger than our 1, so that's going to make 4.3 repeating greater than 4.31. Okay, once you have this, we're going to jump down to our number line here. So let's talk about this number line a little bit. I know we've talked about number lines in science classes, but let's take a look at them again here. I'll zoom in a little bit so you guys can see a little better. So we know we have 0 here, and we have 1 all the way here. So in order to figure out how much our number line is increasing by, we count the number of tick marks in between. And we have 10 tick marks in between 0 and 1. So that means that each tick mark is going to be worth 1/10. Or, so we have 1/10, or we can write that as a decimal, 0.1, which is also read as 1/10. So if I were to go through this number line and I start at 0, I know it's going to be 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, and then 1.0. Okay, so if you would like to put some decimals in between, you can. So we have 0.5 in between 0 and 1. We have 1.5 in between 1 and 2. We have 2.5 in between 2 and 3. Then when we go to the negative side, we're going to have negative 0.5 and negative 1.5. So the first number I want us to look at is negative 1.6. Okay, so we can find negative 1.6. We know it's going to be near negative 1.5, but the thing you have to be careful of is you have to think negatives are opposite. So when I start at 0, this is negative 0.1, negative 0.2, negative 0.3, negative 0.4, negative 0.5. So whenever we're down here, we think this is negative 1, negative 1.1, negative 1.2, negative 1.3, negative 1.4, negative 1.5, and then negative 1.6 is actually on the left side. It's opposite of what we typically think. So then now I want us to figure out where negative 1.6 repeating is. Well, we know negative 1.6 repeating is really just negative 1.66666 and so on. Okay, so that's actually going to be a smaller number, or to the left of negative 1.6. But we know it's not quite going to be negative 1.7 yet. So our point's going to be about right here. And this is going to be negative 1.6 repeating. Then I want us to look at our next number, negative 1.18. Negative 1.18. So when I think about this number, we know it's going to be smaller than negative 1. We need to go in this direction because we know this is negative 0.9, so this is negative 1. This is negative 1.1. This is negative 1.2. So when I'm thinking about the number negative 1.18, that's going to be in between my 0.1 and my 0.2 here. So negative 1.18 is going to be about right here, a little bit closer to the negative 1.2. The next number I want us to look at is negative 0.43, or negative 43 hundredths. So when I think about negative 43 hundredths, or negative 0.43, I know that's not quite negative 0.5 yet, but it's a little bit bigger than negative 0.4. So we're going to go right here in between. Since I'm talking about negative 0.43, it's a little bit closer to the 4 than to the 5. This is going to be negative 0.43. Now we're going to get into the positives, which I know you all like a little better. Our next one is 0.12. So we know 0.12 or 0.12 is going to be in between 0.1 and 0.2. So we know 0.1 is right here and 0.2 is here. Well, since we're talking about 0.12, that 2 makes it a little bit closer to our 1 side. So this is going to be 0.12. Then we're going to have 0.75. We know 0.75 is going to be in between 0.7 and 0.8. And since it's a 5 after our 7, it's actually going to be exactly in the middle of 0.7 and 0.8. Then we're going to have, let's do this a little bit different. Let's do, if I were to give you this point right here, we need to figure out what it is. Okay, so we know this is going to be 1, 1.1, 1.2. This is exactly on 1.3. So now let's think about 1.3 repeating. 1.3 repeating, since it's 1.3333 and so on, it's actually a little bit bigger than the regular 1.3. But it's not quite as big as 1.4. So it's going to be about right here. We're going to have 1.3 repeating. Our next number is 2.09. 2.09. So we know it's going to be at least 2, but this is 2.1 is our next line. Well, 2.1 is too big because I have 2.09. Okay, so we know it's going to be in between our 2 and our 2.1. Well, since we're talking about 0.09, it's going to be really close to our 2.1. Then we have our last number is 2.85. Okay, so we know it's going to be in between 2.8 and 2.9. So this is 2.8 and 2.9. And since it says 2.85, it's going to be exactly in the middle. Let me zoom back out for our next problems. So once you have all those completed, we're going to jump down to adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing positive and negative numbers. So I gave you a whole bunch of rules at the top. And we'll refer to these rules as we need them and as we go along. Okay, but don't forget about them. So let's go to our first row here. Part A, we have negative 6 plus negative 4. So our rule that we're going to use here is this one. It's our rule number 3. It says same signs, we add them, and then keep the sign. So since negative 6 and negative 4 are both negative, they have the same sign. So all we have to do is add 6 and 4 to get 10, and then it says keep the sign. So that means it's going to stay negative. Or you can think about it as I already have 6 negatives, and I'm adding 4 more negatives, so how many negatives do I have? Well, I'm going to have 10 negatives. Okay, so some of you on part A don't like to see double signs. So some of you might want to rewrite this as negative 6 minus 4, and that's okay. You can do that. It's going to be the same thing. You just read, like rule number 1 says, think of a minus sign as a negative. So So again, they would still have the same signs. You would still do the same process. Part B is 8 plus negative 3. So again, we have a double sign, and a lot of times we don't like double signs. If I have a positive and a negative, we know with multiplication, if I have a positive and a negative, it's going to give me a negative. So I can actually just rewrite this as 8 minus 3. That negative is going to win out. And we know that 8 minus 3 is just 5. Okay, then, or you could have, on part B, thought of rule number 4, which says different signs you subtract, and then take the sign of the larger number. So we have a positive with my 8, and a negative with the 3. So those are different signs. So I could have just done 8 minus 3, and then take the sign of the larger number. Well, my 8 is the larger number, and it's positive, so my answer is positive. Okay, part C uses that same rule. We have different signs. The 1 is positive, the 5 is negative. So for different signs, we subtract. Okay, and so you can do this in any order. I could have done 5 minus 1, and I know 5 minus 1 is 4. However, 5 is negative, and it's my bigger number. So this is going to be negative 4. Now, some of you would have liked to rewrite this as 1 minus 5, and you could have thought of that right away as being negative 4. That's also fine to do. Okay, so let's look at our next row. We have negative 4 minus 5. So again, that's rule number 3, where the same signs add, and then we keep the sign. So this is negative 4 and negative 5. Well, they're the same signs. We add them to get 9, and then we take their sign. Some of you might have wanted to rewrite it like A and write negative 4 plus negative 5, and that's fine. You can do it either way. Part E is 7 minus 10. Now, some of you automatically know what the answer is. Okay, but if you don't, you can think of this one. This one's different signs again. Our 7 is positive, our 10 is negative. So we subtract. We do 10 minus 7 to get 3. But we know our negative sign, or our 10 is bigger and it has a negative sign, so our answer is negative 3. However, some of you might have just looked at this and immediately known what it was, and that's great. You can do that too. Same thing with letter F. See if you can figure out letter F on your own. It's very similar to letter E. If you want to pause it, you can until you figure it out, and then you can check it. The answer we're going to get here is negative 1. Okay, now let's jump down here to letter G. Now we have this double negative business. And so we know when we multiply, and I have two negatives, we've talked before how we get a positive. So whenever you see a double negative, if you want to immediately change that to a plus sign, you can. So this is really just 6 plus 2. And we know 6 plus 2 is 8. Same thing for letter H. If you guys see that double negative, you can immediately change it to a plus sign. So this can just be negative 8 plus 4. Well, now we have to think these are opposite signs. These are different signs. So we subtract. So I just do 8 minus 4 and get 4. And then we take the sign of the larger number. Well, we know 8 is larger. And since it's a negative, we keep the negative with our answer. So then I is very similar to H. If you want to do I for me really quick. Think about if there's something we can change. So we know we can change our double negative to a positive. So this is negative 9 plus 3. Again, these are opposite signs. So this is going to give me negative 6. Okay, and then our last one for addition and subtraction here is negative 6 minus 3. Again, it's like letter D. They're the same sign, so we add them and then take their sign. That's going to give me a negative 9. Then letter K, we have negative 9 divided by negative 3. Well, first of all, we know a negative divided by negative is a positive, so I know our answer is positive. And then we have 9 divided by 3 gives us a 3, so my answer is positive 3. Letter L, I'm sorry, is 9 times negative 2. So we have a positive times a negative. And so we talked before, positive times a negative is a negative. And then we just do 9 times 2, and that is 18. And then our last row here, we can also write division this way, but again, we have a negative divided by positive, so that's a negative answer. And then 6 divided by 3 is just 2, so this is going to give me negative 2. Letter N can use rule number 5 here. When multiplying or dividing, if If I have an even number of negatives, then my answer is positive. If I have an odd number of negatives, my answer is negative. Well, here we see we have 3 negatives, so it's odd. We know our answer is going to be negative. Then we just do this in a row. So we do 2 times 2, which gives me 4. And then I still multiply by 2, and 4 times 2 is 8. So my answer is negative 8. And then my last one here, we see I have an even number of negatives, so my answer is going to be positive. And then we just do this one step at a time. We do 5 times 5, which you guys should know is 25. And we still have times 5 times 5. 25 times 5 is 125. If you don't know that, you can work it off to the side like this. 25 times 5, we know 5 times 5 is 25. We carry our 2. 2 times 5 is 10, plus 2 is 12. Okay, but we still need to multiply by 5 again. So this one you may not know in your head. So we would come over here again, 125 times 5. So we do 5 times 5 is 25, carry the 2. 2 times 5 is 10, plus 2 is 12, carry the 1. 1 times 5 is 5, plus the 1 gives us 6. So this is going to give us 625. So now that you have all this done, you guys can start working on your homework. Your homework for day 1 is just pages 1 and 2. Okay, if you get a chance, then you can work ahead. But please make sure you're showing all your work, all your thought process as you're doing this.